Hey there, how's it going? So today I have a tutorial that's slightly different from what I usually do. Today, instead of showing you how to achieve a specific customization, I want to walk you through what the logic is when you're trying to create a hover mode. Now, the reason why I want to create this video is because I get this question a lot in different forms inside the club. And so I think that this is going to help you really understand how a hover mode can be created so that you can build your own for any blog, any section, anything that you want inside Squarespace. Now, I'm going to be working with an auto list in 7.1, but again, what I want you to take from this video is the logic behind creating the hover modes that I'm going to be showing you inside the examples. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here I have my 7.1 site and I want to show you what the settings are for this section that I'm working with, just in case you want to replicate the same thing or if you want to follow along with the video. So here I have an auto list simple list design. So here you can see I'm using the simple list one. For the elements, I just have the title enabled up here and all of these settings down here. For the content, I just have a title in here and a couple of images. And then here for the alignment, I have everything to the left side, content order, media first, 3 columns, the image crop is 1:1. For the style, I have the text size in small, the card block enabled or card layout enabled. I have the padding set to M, and then here for size and space, I have this set to inset, media width, content width set to L, space between items, space between elements set to S, vertical padding set to L, and position set to stretch. All right, so with all of this in place, let's go ahead and get started. So to create a hover mode, you need to have 2 things in place. You need to have a target and a trigger. So those are the 2 basic parts that you need to have to be able to create a hover mode. Now, the target is going to be the thing that you want to change, and the trigger is going to be the area of the block, the section, whatever it is that you want to stand on to be able to make that change happen. So let's go ahead and take a look at how these 2 things work and how you can find each of them with the first example. So the first thing that I want to do in here is change the shape of these images on hover. So what I want to happen here is for the images to stop being a square and become a circle when I hover over some area in here inside my auto layout. So let's go ahead and look for the target container first. So I'm going to go ahead and click here on inspect. And then to be able to find that target, what I recommend is taking a look at a couple of options that you have in here because it doesn't necessarily need to be the first thing that you land on. So you can see that right now I'm standing over the image, but there are actually other containers that could work for what I want to achieve here. So you can see that if I stand over this previous one, the one that is currently holding the image, this one has the same size and the same shape and everything. So this could definitely be an option for me to use as a target container. And then if I keep going up, I have another one over here that is sort of the grandparent of the image that I have down here. Now, this one does have a little bit of a margin at the bottom, which could make the shape not be like an exact circle. So maybe we shouldn't really use this one. Again, it depends on what you're going after, but I think that in my situation, this may not work exactly how I want it to work, so I think I'm going to skip this one. And then if I go to this previous one that I have in here, you can see how this one is not really holding the image itself. It's a little bit bigger than that. So this is definitely something that I don't want to work with because I want to make sure that the image only is the one that changes in shape. So one quick thing, and this is sort of like a side note when it comes to making modifications for images. If you don't have to use a property that has to be applied to the image element itself, because sometimes you do need to do that. But if you want to apply things, especially if you want to modify things in the edges of the image, so if you want to apply a box shadow, a border, if you want to change the border radius, anything that again goes to the edges of the images, I highly suggest not targeting the image element itself. And the reason why I'm suggesting this is because if you see here, the image is actually a little bit larger than the container that's holding it. So you can think about it, if you work with Photoshop, you can think about the image being inside a mask. So you can see that you have the container, like the square in the situation, that is sort of cropping the image. The image is actually bigger than the square. So if you apply something directly to the image and you're applying something to the edges of the image, if the image is bigger than the mask that is holding it, you're not really going to see that change happening. So that's why I suggest, whenever possible, not targeting the image itself, but targeting the container that's directly holding the image. So in this situation, that means that instead of using my image element in here as that target to be able to create my hover mode, what I'm going to be using instead is this container that's holding it, that has a class here of list item media inner. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this class that I have in here to be able to have my target in place. So I'm just going to go ahead and place that inside my custom CSS window. And for the sake of this tutorial, to try to keep this as short as possible, I'm not really going to be focusing on making things specific for this block, this section, this item, whatever. So I'm not really going to be looking into specificity in here. If you want to apply a hover mode specific for a block, for a section, for a page, anything like that, then you need to look for the data section ID, the block ID, the page ID, anything that is going to help you sort of narrow down the area where you want the hover mode applied. So in this situation, again, I'm not really going to be building a larger selector than this. I just want to make sure that I'm using the class or the ID or whatever that is going to help me locate or point to that target that I want to change when I have my hover mode applied. All right, so with that being said, again, here I have my target. This is going to be the target of the hover mode. And then before building the actual hover mode, what I would recommend is actually testing out that you're actually going to get the final result you want with the target container that you chose. So in this situation, what I want to do here is I'm actually not going to turn this into a circle. I think that I'm only going to be modifying like two edges, like two corners of the image, or actually the container holding the image, to sort of crop those two. So what I'm going to be doing here is using the border, let's do top left radius, and then I'm going to be setting this one to 50%. So you're going to see here that now we have that top left corner. In fact, you know what? I think I'm going to do the right side. There we go. Okay, so now we have that first corner rounded up in there. And again, right now we're not really focusing on making this happen on hover mode. We're just testing out that the actual result that we want to have on hover mode is possible, and to set everything up before bringing in our trigger. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing for the opposite corner. So let's do here border bottom left radius, and I'm going to set that to 50%. All right, perfect. So this is the final shape that I want my image to have when the hover mode is activated. So this is the final result that I want. This is great. I'm done with my target. Now let's go ahead and find the trigger for this hover mode. So one thing you really need to keep in mind is that if you're going to be creating a hover mode with CSS, the trigger has to be either a parent container, a grandparent container, or a great-grandparent container. It cannot be anything that is sitting below the element that is your target. So if we take a look in here, you're going to see that this is the target container, okay? So that means that everything that we have underneath that cannot be a trigger. Like automatically, all of these things that we have below that target element or that target container can be completely ignored, because those cannot be a trigger for this target container using just CSS. Now, if we take a look at the things that we have before inside the HTML, so that we have before this target container, we can see that we have this element here. So I'm just going to stand over this one. We have this one that is the direct parent container. You can see it in here. We have this little line here. So this is a direct parent container. We could use this one. And so to be able to determine whether you want to use it or not, basically what you need to do is just look in the screen to see the area that should be hovered over to be able to activate the hover mode. So if this was the trigger, it means that we need to put our cursor inside that blue area that we have in there to be able to activate it. Now, personally, I think that's a little bit too small for what I want. I don't really want people to have to hover or to hover over the area of the image to be able to activate the hover mode. I want them to be able to hover over the entire like item that we have in there to be able to activate that hover mode. So I'm going to skip this one. This is not going to work for what I want. I'm going to keep looking upwards. So here we have another container. So this one, you can see how it's actually holding everything that we have inside this item. So this could definitely be the trigger that I want to use here, or this could be an option for the trigger that I want to use. Because again, this one is going to give me sort of like a bigger area that I can hover over to be able to activate that hover mode. If I keep looking upwards, I can see here that we have, this would be what, like the great grandparent container or something of the target. You can see that this one that I'm standing over here is actually a little bit too big, because if I were to use this one as my trigger, it means that any of the area that I'm highlighting right now is going to activate that hover mode, and I don't really want that. I don't want people to stand over like the side of the screen over here and activate the hover mode. That's kind of a little bit weird. So again, what I think is going to work best is to grab this item that we have in here, or this element that we have in here, and use this one as our trigger. Now, one quick note about this, there is a way to use a sort of like an older sibling to create a hover mode, but we're not going to look into this right now. It's just something to keep in mind. That is definitely a possibility, but in general terms, when you're looking for the trigger, make sure to look for a parent container, grandparent container, or great-great-parent container. So just keep in mind that those are the three main things that you should look for. Again, anything that is sitting below the target container cannot be used as a trigger. It has to be something that is sitting before inside the HTML. All right, so now with that out of the way, I'm just going to go ahead and grab one of the classes from this container to be able to create my trigger. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab this list item class that we have in here. And then I'm going to place that in here inside my selector. So now, right now, you can see how everything is still showing on the screen. And this is because I haven't really used the hover selector that I need to apply in here to be able to actually create that trigger. So this is my trigger container. And then basically what I need to do is attach to it, to that trigger container, I need to attach the hover pseudo class in here. So now that we have this in here, what's going to happen is that if I stand over any part of that block, because remember that that list item is sort of was highlighting the whole thing, like the whole item that we have in here. So now if I stand on any part of this block, you're going to see how the image changes in shape. And the same thing happens for this one, and the same thing happens for this one. And that is because these two things share the exact same class and the exact same structure as this first one that I was looking through inside the inspect element tool. Okay, so now that we have this set, we have our target, we have our trigger, all is working great. But personally, I think that the change that is happening here is a little bit too sudden. So it's sort of like a square and then whoop, it changes into that shape like immediately. It's a little bit too abrupt for my taste. So what I'm gonna do is add a little bit of a transition here. So if you want to make things smoother in your hover mode, what you can do is just that. Use the transition property to be able to make that change a little bit softer. So the best way that I've found to be able to create this smooth transition, both when you're hovering over the thing and when you're hovering out of the thing, unhovering the thing, whatever. The best way that I've found to set this up is to apply the transition property to the target container when you don't have the trigger involved. So that means grabbing whichever selector you're using to target that target container and then applying the transition property to that specific area, element, whatever. So that means that here I have again the selector for that element, and then what I'm gonna do is apply the transition property. So here you can decide if you want to target like a specific property that you want to apply the transition to. But personally, I'm just going to be using the all keyword to make anything that's changing like a little bit smoother. So I'm just gonna go ahead and use the all keyword here and just set maybe like 0.5 seconds or something like that. And so now if I hover over these elements, you're gonna see how now we have a smoother transition from one shape to the other. Now, one thing to keep in mind that you may be noticing is that there is a little delay in terms of when the change starts happening. So you can see that it doesn't really happen as soon as I stand over the image or the item that I have in here. And that is actually because I have animations enabled in 7.1. So if you have animations on like globally set in 7.1, or if you have animations applied to the specific block that you're trying to create the hover mode on, you may run into this issue where there's a little bit of a delay. So if you want to remove that, basically what you can do is go into the element. It doesn't happen all the time. It depends on the element that you're targeting. But basically what we can do here, let me show you real quick why that's happening. So if we go back into that target container, which is list item media inner, list item media inner, where is list item media inner? It's going to be easier this way. Okay, here we go. List item media inner. So if we stand over this element, again, our target, the one where we're applying that transition property, you can see that all the way up here, we have a transition delay applied. So this is something, again, that Squarespace is adding automatically because of the animations that I have enabled on the side. So this transition is the one that is creating that sort of lag in between when I hover over the element and the transition or like the change applies. So what I'm gonna do is make sure that that transition delay doesn't affect this hover mode. So I'm gonna go ahead and set here transition delay 0 seconds important. I have to use important here because the original value was applied over here inside like the element style section. So that means that is an inline style. It was applied either to the HTML itself or via JavaScript. Doesn't really matter. The point is that because the value was here, like the property and the value was originally up here, I need to use important to be able to override it. So anyway, now that I have that applied, you can see how immediately, as soon as I stand over my trigger, the hover mode applies for that image. Now, one thing to keep in mind about this is that removing that transition delay may affect the way that the animation works when you're loading that element. So just keep that in the back of your mind. If you don't really mind the delay in the hover mode, I would suggest leaving that as it is. But again, if you want to remove it, now you know how to do it. All right, so this is pretty much it for how the logic works behind a hover mode. So let's go ahead and take a look at a second example. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all of this code that I have in here. And now the next example that I want to show you is actually a pretty cool one. So basically what I want to do here is now I want the items that I have in here, I want them to sort of levitate a little bit when we're on hover mode. So let's go ahead and look for our target container first. So let's see what I want to sort of levitate in here. I think that what I want to move upwards or like shift upwards is the whole element. So I want the whole like little block that I have in here. I want it to move upwards, like slide upwards, and also get like a little bit of a shadow. So it looks like it's sort of actually moving from the screen. I think that's going to look really cool. So this is going to be my target container, which means that I need to grab a class from it. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab that list item class from before. And now again, this is going to be my target for the hover mode. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and test out the things that I want this thing to look like when we're on hover, just to make sure that everything is going to look nice. So let's go ahead and do here transform, translate Y, because I want to move upwards. And then I'm going to move, or I'm going to be using a negative number here. So let's do maybe like minus 50 pixels or something like that. All right, so everything shifts upwards. That's great. And now I want to apply a box shadow in here as well. So I'm gonna do 20 pixels, like 0.1 maybe. All right, I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so this is the final result that I want in here. And now what I need to do is look for that trigger, the thing that is going to actually activate this final result. Okay, so looking at what we have in here, remember that anything that is sitting below that target container cannot be our trigger. It has to be a parent, a grandparent, or a great-grandparent container. it could also be two other things though. It could be an older sibling, which we're not going to be tackling in this tutorial, or it could be the element itself, like the same target container can also be the trigger. So in this situation, if we were to look for a parent container or any other ancestor container in here, these are all going to be too big, like they're going to occupy too much space. Again, I don't really want people to like hover over this side of the section and then have everything like lifting upwards. Like that's not the way that I want this hover mode to work. I want people to hover over this element and the element itself to move upwards. So in this situation, I'm going to have the target and the trigger be the exact same element. So if we have that in here, if we already have our target container applied here, we have all of the properties that we want this thing to have as the final result, then basically what we need to do, if again, this same container is going to be both things for us, then all we need to do here is apply that hover selector. And once we do that, if we now stand over these elements that we have in here, you can see how they lift upwards when we're touching them. Now, again, I'm going to go ahead and make this transition a little bit smoother because I don't really like how abrupt it is at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the selector for my target container, which again, in this case, it's acting as both things. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that, and then I'm going to apply that transition property in here. So I'm going to set it again to all, maybe like 0.5 seconds. And then here we still have, or seem to have, that delay issue. It doesn't really bother me right now, so I think I'm actually not going to remove that delay. But if you do want to remove the delay, now you know how to do it. You need to make sure to set that transition delay to 0 seconds, and most likely you're gonna have to set it to important, like if we wanted to do it in here. Let's just take a quick look here at list item. Where's my list item? The list item media, here's list item. All right, so here, yeah, we can see that the transition delay has been applied up here. So that means that we need to override it by using the important rule. So if you wanted to make that happen, now you know how to make it happen. But again, I think this looks pretty good. So I'm actually going to leave it this way. All right, so this is pretty much it for the second example. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a third one. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and remove all of this code that I have in here. And now what I want to do is actually create a hover mode for the buttons. So what I want the buttons to do on hover is to stretch out, to occupy the rest of the space that we have in here, and to change color, because I think that's going to look really cool. So let's go ahead and start with our target. So if we take a look in here and look at that button element, let's see here. Okay, so perfect. I landed directly on the actual like link button element in here. And then here I have another container that is apparently holding the button. And then here I have another one. And this one is a little bit too big. So this one is just holding the text, and this one is holding both the text and the button. So I think either this one, or this one could be my target elements. Now, because of what I want to do for the button, because how I want the button to grow and to change color, I think that targeting the actual button itself, so the one that's currently carrying the background color, is just going to be the best way to go, because it's just going to allow me to override that color like directly on the thing that is actually colored at the moment. And it's just going to help me avoid a couple of issues. So I'm just going to go ahead and target this A element that I have in here through one of its classes. Let's just use list item content button, and then I'm going to go ahead and use this as my target. So again, this is going to be my target container. So what I want to have in here is, again, a width of 100%, because I want this button to expand 100%. And then what I want to do is change the color of this. So let's go ahead and set this to blue. And I think we're gonna have to make that one important. Let's take a quick look here. So if we take a look on the right side, we can see how the background color has been applied underneath this big selector that we have here that is targeting the same thing that we're targeting, but it's a lot more specific. Now again, I'm not really going to be dealing with specificity in this video. I'm not really going to be building a bigger or more specific selector, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the important rule in here. And there we go. Okay, so now we have the color applied and the width that we want this to have. Okay, so the next thing that we could do here is actually align the text to the middle because it's not really looking right now. So let's just set this to text align center. Now, one quick thing I should note about this is that both the width and the text align that I'm using in here are working for this button because of how this button has originally been set up. So when you're trying to apply this sort of thing to maybe a different type of container, a different type of button, it may not necessarily work right off the bat, depending on the type of button that you're working with. So right now, this button is actually set as inline block, if I'm not mistaken. You can see in here that if I look through the right side, yeah, there we go. So here you can see how the display property for this button has been set to inline block. So this is what's allowing me to stretch out the width and set the text align to the center. So depending on how your button is built or how whatever it is that you're working with is built, you may or may not be able to do things this easily. You may have to add additional things to make things work for you. So just keep that in mind. All right, so now that we have the final result that we want for our target, let's go ahead and look for our trigger. So what part of this whole thing that we have in here do we want to act as a trigger for it? Which part do we want to have people hover over to be able to create this final look? So I think once again, I'm going to go back to that list item container because I feel like if you hover over any part of this block in here, the button should expand. Like I feel that's the best way that this is going to work out. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that list item container as my trigger again. So I'm going to add it in here, list item. And then again, to be able to turn this into an actual trigger, I need to add here the hover selector. So once I do that, you're going to see how everything sort of goes back to the way it was before. And now if I hover over any part of the image, what's going to happen is that now we have that width going all the way, or like the button expanding all the way across to 100% of the width of its parent container, and we have the text changing color. So that's awesome. Now let's go ahead and move on to the transition. So again, the transition, I'm going to apply it to the target element itself. Again, this is the best way that I found to make really smooth transitions going in and out. So I'm going to copy that target container selector in here. And then I'm going to apply the transition to it. So let's go ahead and do all 0.5 seconds again, I think. And now if I hover over this, you're going to see how nothing is really happening. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what is going on here. So if we take a look at that button element, because again, this is where we're adding the transition. So that's what we need to look for. I'm looking for that element that is our target container. And then if we take a look through the right side, we're going to see that if we look for our little snippet here, where is it? Here, we can see that we're targeting through list item content button. So this is the little snippet that we wrote in here. And we can see that the transition property and its value, it's being completely crossed off. So that means that something else is overriding it. And then if we take a look a little bit up here, you can see how there's original transition up here that's changing the opacity and something there. And you can see how this is actually applied to a much specific selector. So again, because I'm not really going to be dealing with specificity in here, I'm just going to go ahead and apply an important rule to this to make sure that this is overriding the original transition. So if I set this to important over here, now I hover over the image, you're going to see two things. So the first one is that the width is not really becoming any more smoother than it was before. But you can see how the color is actually showing up with a little bit more of a transition, basically. I'm actually going to slow things down so you can see the effect on the color. You can see how the blue color is actually going in and out a lot more just softer, I guess, than the way that this is expanding to 100%. And the reason for this, and this is something that you need to keep in mind when you're creating hover mode, if there are not enough things to keep in mind so far. One other thing that you need to keep in mind is that some properties can be a little bit tricky to work with when you're creating a hover mode animation. So in this situation, the width of 100%, if we want this to apply and to actually have that that button sort of stretch out and shrink down nicely, we actually have to set an original width to start with. So the problem here is that we can't really use with auto, which would be great because this means that we don't really need to calculate how big the button should be. The browser is basically going to calculate it itself because this is an inline block element or an inline block button. But if we use with auto, this is not really going to give us the result that we want. So we actually need to set in here an original width that we want the button to have from then on to stretch on to 100%. So here, let's just say that we want the button to be maybe 120 pixels. That's a little bit too small, so maybe 130 pixels. 50 pixels. Okay, I think that looks a little bit better, but you can see how now the text is not really in the middle. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to remove the text align from the hover and apply it like all the time. So not necessarily just on hover, but when we're on non-hover mode as well. So I'm just gonna go ahead and add that in here, text align center. All right, so now we have the button looking pretty similar to how it was before. Again, unfortunately, we do have to set this original width, so you're gonna have to calculate how big you want your button to be if you're using this sort of hover mode animation. But anyway, now that we have this in place, you're gonna see that with that original width and the width that is going to change to and the transition, now if I hover over this, we can see how that button actually stretches out nicely. So again, you can see how if I hover over any of my triggers here, we have the change happening for both the width and for the background color. Now, one quick thing that I want to do in here, just to make sure that this like stretch out button looks a little bit better, is that I'm actually going to center the whole content, because if we have the button in the center, then the stretching is going to happen like to both sides evenly. It's not going to happen just to like the side where the extra space is available. So if I go back into edit content, design, and I'll align everything to the center, save this. Let's take a quick look here. All right, so now if I hover over this, yeah. All right, that looks a lot better. All right, and that's everything that I have for you today. I really hope that you found this helpful and that you feel encouraged and inspired to be able to create your own hover modes for anything else that you want in Squarespace. Remember that if you have any suggestions for additional content that you'd like to see, you can go ahead and leave a comment down below. I'll see you next time.